I think one of the sort of major weaknesses since the NHS was started is its concentration on the treatment of ill health rather than the creation of good health. And I think these two have got to be balanced. And I know that Wales and the National Assembly have had a public health strategy, which has been far-sighted, but I think that needs to be pushed much further. The link between social services and the health service is obviously absolutely key. And we have to work around the fact that they are funded by two different bodies and managed by two different bodies, because it is an inconvenience. And I know there have been debates about whether health and social and the council social services and all the different therapies should all be under one. And I know that that has not happened. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because of the fear that the NHS would dominate in that sort of, if those two were brought together. But I think actually in the UK, it's only in Northern Ireland, they're actually under one body where social services is part of the health service as well. But I think, you know, Wales has got a high number of older people. I mean, it's a huge issue about our older population who need to be treated with dignity and respect, and every effort needs to be made to try to keep them in their own homes. And that's where everyone here is absolute key. That people have these services at home, and they have the you know, the sit-down showers, they have the grab rails, and they have the occupational therapy. They have all those things that enable them to live independent lives. And so that's where I think we have to put our emphasis to keep people at home. I was a carer for my mother for 6 years. She had a stroke, and she was cared for at home. And I worked out we actually had 26 different people involved in her care. And trying to manage it was managing like a small business. So I think we have to try and individualise these social care packages to ensure that we can enable older people in particular to live with dignity at home.
Generally, the people who ask the questions have an answer in mind. If I just pause for a second and ask you, Christine, I mean, what would you like to see happen in terms of social care and health? Should they be under one big budget, or is there a risk that you'd be dominated by Big Brother NHS?
It has in fact happened in Ceredigion. There has been an integration of services. We certainly are working in a more integrated way, so we do tackle issues like delayed transfers of care, which I don't think are actually down to therapists as being the reason for the delayed transfers of care. Our role is obviously enabling people, so enabling people to lead independent lives without packages of care would be a huge part of our work. The debate is open as to the true integration. One of the big issues is the differential in pay terms and conditions, which is something that has to be looked at in more depth. But we are working very hard with our colleagues in the NHS to work in more integrated ways for the benefit of the individual.
Okay, well, Dr. Dyloid's come to you. I mean, we've heard a lot about care of the elderly and delayed transfers of care. It's a growing problem, we know, over the next 10, 20 years. What's your solution?
Well, we've got to, as a society, number one, think of care as more than health care, basically, and so naturally you think of health and social care together. Yes, there are examples of pooled budgets now, and we look to expand on that and eventually have health and social care together. I mean, you've got to think of the whole public service in Wales. That includes local government, the civil service, the assembly, and health, and looking at a leaner, meaner, sharper public sector, public service in terms of, you know, we can't afford 22 of everything, I would contend, in local government. And we have to look at doing lots more things regionally in local government, and social services, I would contend, would be one of those. And of sort of thinking regionally, you might as well go down the sort of regions that the health boards, the new health boards already are, otherwise you end up reorganising health, because I think it is a particular strength when health and social services are co-terminus, have the same boundaries. In Powys, and obviously where we have pooled budgets in Ceredigion and Carmarthenshire, where people are not fighting and protecting their budgets, they actually do take the patient centrally, and everybody sorts out what needs doing without being overprotective about their budgets. And in areas like Northern Ireland, where that system works, you know, we have about, I think, 400 delayed transfers of care in Wales per year, the number always hovers around, 400 people being in hospital where they should be somewhere
Yes,
else.
I also want to see a greater emphasis on tailored social care, because at the moment I think the social care system is a bit too one-size-fits-all. It doesn't necessarily take into consideration that different people need different treatments. And one of the things that the Welsh Liberal Democrats want to see in the next Assembly government is greater use of the personal budget scheme, which was alluded to a bit earlier on, so that people get greater choice and control over the care that they do receive. Where do therapists come into that role? Well, if people feel that a certain therapy would benefit them better than the treatment they're told they're going to have, then they can then use that personal budget to bring somebody in that they feel would be beneficial to them. And I think our role as politicians or as experts is to make sure that people have the information available to them so they can make that informed decisions best they can, so that they get the best treatment they can, rather than what I think the system's been at the moment is just people telling people what is best for them, rather than providing the information and letting them make their informed decision themselves.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Christine, for that question. Is there anyone else in the OT world who wants to have a say about what they've heard so far? Don't be shy. There we go, the hand up.
I work as part of a rehabilitation OT, and I want to know what any of you might suggest you're going to do.
Even though some substantial work has been done on workforce planning, we're still nowhere near where we need to be. There are some big gaps in service provision. We've already seen a decrease in the number of positions being commissioned. And we also know that it's difficult to understand the true picture within primary care, because the Health Committee did recommend that the GP contract be amended so that GPs were required to tell us the number of therapists and other professions that they were employing, because we need a truer picture so that we know exactly who is working in the community. There's a very quick anecdote. My grandfather, for the past 2 years, was going back and forth to his GP, a brilliant GP. He thought he had back pain, he was doubled up, he could barely walk, and suddenly he realised he thought he'd go and see his physiotherapist in Whitchurch Village. The guy had a quick look at him, did his work, and said, Winston, he said, I think your hip's gone, it's not your back.
In terms of what to do with a very tight and diminishing financial cake, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the cake that the Assembly gets to divide up is historically not enough, everybody agrees, in terms of whole-term commissions and the like. And if we had a needs-based formula, we'd get at least another £300 million per year. On top of that, in terms of the response to the current financial crisis, the Assembly budget will lose £1.52 billion of that inadequate amount. So there are huge challenges facing us all in all departments, which is why, as I mentioned in an earlier answer, we have to look at how we organise all of the public sector services in Wales, not just health, but local government and the Assembly services as well, because, you know, put plainly, as regards local government, we just can't afford 22 of everything. We can't afford 22 local education authorities, we can't afford 22 social services departments, and so it goes on. So in terms of getting a leaner, meaner, sharper sort of bureaucracy to run things, that means then protecting the sort of cold face, as it were, to ensure, because we have an absolute commitment to deliver for the most vulnerable of our patients and clients and people in Wales generally. So it's about protecting frontline services and making sure that we rearrange public services to be able to deliver that.
Okay, well, Julie Morgan, your party's been coalition organised part of the last 4 years. Neither of you are offering to protect in line with inflation and ring fence, as we hear about in England. What then can you tell these people about their future job security?
Well, certainly, I mean, in the budget for the next year, I think in cash terms, it will not be going down, it'll be the same.
But it won't keep up with inflation or health inflation, which is much higher.
Yeah, and it won't be ring-fenced, and that is because there is so much outside the health service that is of equal importance to the health service, because I don't think you can separate, you know, the social services from the health service, or the housing from the health service, because they're all equally important. So we are not ring-fencing the health service, because we see it as a much more in a much more sort of holistic way. And in terms of getting the workforce planning right, I think it is extremely difficult to actually anticipate how you're going to match training places and work opportunities. And I know there are some therapists poor training who are concerned about whether they will actually, you know, get posts at the end. And I know it is extremely difficult to do, and we've just got to get sharper and better at doing it, because it is difficult to anticipate as well with a workforce. I mean, I think the workforce is mainly females. This room reflects that. You know what's within 35 years' time, people, you know, women will want to work straight through or not, and all those things have got to be taken into account. So I just think we've got to be much sharper, much clearer, and we must link the training opportunities with the jobs, because as I understand it, most of the training is done with health service bursaries, so we're actually planning for, you know, for our future workers in a very direct way. So we've got to be sharper, quicker, and more serious planning.
Okay, Matt, we'll get your party's manifesto later this week.
You will, yes.
What answer have you got on this pretty vital question, the cross-health and social care?
Of course, I mean, every department in the Assembly government is worried about cuts at the moment, and rightly so. But unfortunately, what's happened with the leadership of the Labour Applied Administration in the Assembly over the last 4 years is they've turned waste into an art form, I'm afraid to say. And there's been an independent report commissioned recently that said that 20% of the health budget wasn't being spent correctly. And the health minister just swept it under the carpet. So the first thing we actually need to do is investigate exactly what's being wasted, and then try and reinvest as much of that back into frontline services as possible. And I don't think sweeping it under the carpet. If somebody told me that I was spending 20% of my budget ineffectively, I'd want to know why that was, and I'd want to know how I could then save some of that money and reinvest it. So I think a bit more of imaginative government is needed over the next term to make sure that we can reinvest as much of that money back into the services as possible, so we can avoid as few cuts as possible.
I've been asked by one of the speech therapists, ironically, for everyone to keep their voices up, because some people in the back might be having difficulty hearing. Jonathan, your party is different to the other three in terms of claims that it can protect the health budget in line with inflation. People have been scrutinising that policy pretty carefully. What does it mean for the workforce, though?
If we are in a position to protect the NHS budget in Wales, I feel very strongly that we will be in a position to invest in a smarter way in therapy services. What we have seen in recent years has been a decrease in the number of training places commissioned. In fact, what's happened, I suppose, is more of a realignment between the commissioning of training places and the places that are actually available for employment. And I think roughly 70 to 80% of those trained within the therapy professions have got jobs in Wales. So I think there has been a long-standing recognition of the incredible role that therapy has to play. But if we are going to shift the provision of health and care away from the acute sector to services provided in our villages, in people's homes, then that's where the emphasis has got to be. And it will take some very difficult decisions over the next 5 years as how to do that. In effect, it means taking services out of one place, revamping them and sticking them somewhere else. Di touched on this about the sort of reforms that might have to happen. But ultimately it means that there's more of an emphasis on those sorts of services which are not sort of clinically driven within the acute sector. Now, if we can protect our health spend, if we could be more effective in the way that we spend our resources, if we can see more of a duty on our health boards and on our local authorities to find smarter ways of spending public money. Apart from chairing the Health Committee for almost 4 years, I chaired the Public Accounts Committee. And it was scary, absolutely scary, at how bad some of our public bodies have been at spending your money. And it's money that employs you. If we can find better ways of spending that money, it means we have the capacity to invest in therapy services. And one thing which I think has got to change, we cannot have this annual discussion where you are having to try and inform what levels of commissioning in terms of numbers are required. It's got to be 5-year planning. We need proper planning in the system so that we know longer term where therapy services need to be. We need some smarter strategic thinking. I have to say the report that we wrote gave an indication as to where that needed a start, but we've got a lot further to go. But it's that 5-year planning. You know, we work on budget cycles that are longer than 12 months, and so do you. And I do not think that we can merely look at the workforce just on a 12-month